I'm going to be speaking at some length, Christine On already covered a lot of this, about North Korea. And one thing that I want to say is that after several decades of being at war with North Korea, our vision of North Korea is far from clear-sighted. We perceive North Korea with enormous amounts of misinformation and disinformation. And both of those ways of knowing North Korea are, part and parcel of the fact of war. To have misinformation and disinformation about North Korea is indeed a strategy of war. So I want to say something. Because Bruce Cummings unfortunately couldn't be here, well, I'm actually glad that you were able to see him in the film. I'm going to do what he plausibly would do and continue on with what Christine On started, which is to situate what the media presents as the North Korean crisis in necessary historical context. As many activists and critical scholars have observed, as did Jian Ya in this documentary that we just saw, the Cold War may have ended elsewhere around the globe, but Korea stands out, almost anachronistically, as a Cold War hotspot, unthawed and volatile. When Russia and China recognized South Korea at the so-called end of the Cold War, it was widely assumed that the United States should and would follow suit and recognize North Korea. Yet on the face of things, in this supposedly post-Cold War world, North Korea still functions as enemy number one of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. The question that I want to pose through an urgent revisitation of the history of U.S.-North Korea relations is what ideological role North Korea plays relative to what many of the speakers have addressed today, namely the U.S. military and economic pivot to Asia and the Pacific. Why at this historical moment does the spectacle of a North Korean threat loom so large in Department of Defense statements, in the Western media, in neoconservative think tank policy reports? Why do we hear singularly and incomprehensibly about North Korean provocations, and what ideological work does a decontextualized portrait of North Korean danger, aggression, and bellicosity serve as far as U.S. interests within the Asia-Pacific region are concerned? To answer these questions, we have to go back and speaking to the Korean War in order to reframe and to engage the present critically and consciously as one in which, in fact, the Korean War has never ended, indeed remains strategically unresolved. We should be clear, upon North Korea's, China's, and the United States' signing of the July 27, 1953 armistice agreement 60 years ago, peace did not ensue in Korea. This agreement, which we have heard the Western media describe as summarily rejected by North Korea within recent months, recommended, as Christine mentioned, that all three parties return to the negotiating table within 90 days to settle a permanent peace agreement and to arrange the withdrawal of all foreign forces from Korea. And that's indeed the function of an armistice agreement. It's a penultimate agreement that is to be followed upon by a peace agreement. Although China withdrew its forces within 5 years' time, the United States to this day, in a violation of the intended eventual purpose of the armistice agreement, stations 28,500 forces and operates an estimated 100 military installations south of the DMZ. Sanctions that are aimed at North Korean regime collapse have been in place since Truman directed a comprehensive battery of sanctions against North Korea as part of his war strategy to eliminate the Asian socialist nation. Supposedly aimed at preventing North Korea from further developing its nuclear option or weapons programs, these sanctions have been routinely renewed and refortified since mid-century, even when they adversely impact access to humanitarian food aid, and cash needed for agricultural development. And indeed, the recent round of sanctions we already know has negatively impacted what little humanitarian food relief is going into North Korea right now. And things that have what are viewed very loosely as having dual-use purpose, including fertilizer, including like the lead in pencils, including syringes, anything that can be weaponized, even though it's really essential to food production and health services, those things too are denied. And this is far from an unintended consequence, right? This is the sinister function of sanctions as a weapon of imperialist intervention, namely to create a situation that is so dire within a country that the people, in theory, might be compelled to revolt against their leadership. And, you know, as Christine also mentioned, there have been these massive war games. And, it's a very interesting thing. This is, David Vine was speaking about, it was some sort of analogy of like, what would it be like if Mexico and Russia, built a lily pad near the United States. And we could also ask if Cuba and Russia practiced massive war games that simulated the regime collapse and occupation of the United States. Would the United States just say, oh, that's simply business as usual, or would they take that as a provocative action? So that's one way that we have to contextualize North Korea's recent quote-unquote provocations coming during and on the heels of massive war games. And we're going to have another round of war games this August, so stay tuned, So I'm reminded here of the plaintive cry of U.S. President George W. Bush's post-9/11 question, why do they hate us? And Chalmers Johnson's response, blowback. With regard to North Korea, we have to ask, blowback from what? How do we explain North Korea's radical adherence to self-defense and to principles of self-reliance? We should recall that, as Bruce Cummings was talking about, North Koreans were subjected to what Cummings actually calls a bombing holocaust at the hands of the United States. As Cummings puts it, the North Koreans suffered the most appalling, unrestrained, genocidal bombing campaigns in our genocidal 20th century, and ever since have been shouting themselves hoarse at a nation of amnesiacs who aren't listening. The United States virtually owned the Allies at mid-century, and the Korean War, as an asymmetrical war of intervention by the United States, left an estimated 3.5 million dead in North Korea, 70% of whom were civilians. North Korea was viewed by the United States during this time as a giant free fire zone, and its were collateralized. In effect, the air-to-ground nature of the Korean War situated an almost unarmed enemy. I mean, this is in the observation of Reginald Thompson, who was a British journalist, an almost unarmed enemy against obliterating U.S. air power. This is how Thompson described the North Korean peasants. He said that they were confronted by the appalling horror of jellied patrol bombs, i.e. napalm, and the devastation of rockets and heavy artillery, yet they defied the immense weight of modern arms with a few rifles and a hopeless courage. He said that their shots were shots of the doomed, and this is what he said. Every enemy shot, he said, released a deluge of destruction. Every village and township in the path of war was blotted out. In such warfare, the slayer needs merely to touch a button, and death is on the wing, blindly blotting out the remote, the unknown people, holocausts of death, veritable mass production of death, spreading an abysmal desolation over whole communities. I mean, kind of sounds like, you know, a sort of anticipation of drone warfare. Indeed, written within the first 3 months of the Korean War, vast swaths of North Korean cities had been destroyed. Within another month, nearly all North Korean villages had been obliterated. And indeed, you know, on Pyongyang alone, which had about 400,000 residents, the United States dropped 420,000 bombs, more than one per person. I mean, that is truly the definition of overkill. Roughly a year into the war, Monica Felton, a British delegate of the Women's International Democratic Federation, observed that during her travels throughout North Korea, the same of destruction repeated themselves over and over again. The destruction is so overwhelming, Felton stated, that if the war is allowed to continue even for a few months, there will be nothing left of Korea, nothing at all. I say that because that's not a portrait of North Korea that we are acquainted with. Absolutely necessary historical backdrop to understand that North Korea, its self-defense posture, comes from this profound and ubiquitous memory of ruin at the hands of the United States. Let's flash forward to the present. North Korea is still situated in a kill chain relationship to the United States. The United States is situated in a kill chain relationship to North Korea. The two dominant ways that the U.S. knows North Korea are through defector intelligence, and defector intelligence is what the CIA calls HUMINT, or human intelligence, and satellite intelligence, or what the CIA and the U.S. military call IMINT, or imagery intelligence. And in fact, these are the two primary ways establishing a critical account of North Korean human rights. But before we say this is absolute evidence, we have to be judicious. In the wake of 9/11, let's remember the two primary sources of evidence that Colin Powell took to the United Nations to argue for U.S. war in Iraq. It was defector intelligence and imagery intelligence. So this is just to say that we should be wary of what we think we know about North Korea. About North Korea. In the United States, I would say that our perspective is conditioned by, and indeed still beclouded by, the fog of war. Why is this? What is the strategic value and what are the benefits of North Korea framed as a hair-trigger crazy and evil enemy of the United States? Let's recall that the Korean War, or what might be understood as the first regime change policy of the United States against North Korea, it's okay, there's a different system. Okay. Was absolutely crucial to the consolidation. So, in other words, the Korean War, let me say this again, this regime change policy against North Korea mid-century was absolutely crucial to the consolidation of U.S. imperial expansion and global capitalist hegemony. The Korean War crystallized the U.S. national security state, the military-industrial complex, and the perpetual war economy, all conditioned within a self-serving regime of forgetting. In essence, it placed the United States on a permanent war footing. I always think of Rosie the Riveter not as a feminist icon. I think of her as a total war icon. And in the wake of World War II, the United States was in dire straits. And so listen to the end of World War II, 45, beginning of the Korean War, according to the U.S. periodization, it's 1950. That's half a decade. And so listen to how Dean Acheson described the Korean War. He said, "The Korean War came and saved us." A general, U.S. military general, was quoting as saying, "Korea has been a blessing." And so, for a U.S. economy coming to a total war scenario, Korea was indeed a blessing. So, to this day, The portrait of an unhinged, trigger-happy North Korea justifies the acceleration of the introduction of missile defense systems in Guam, the positioning of nuclear aircraft carriers throughout the Pacific, sales of U.S. military weapons to U.S. client states throughout the Asia-Pacific region, not to mention, as I was saying before, a continuation of this forward U.S. military posture. Reason tells us that China is the U.S.'s main economic rival, but an armed and dangerous North Korea furnishes the necessary pretext for a heavily militarized U.S. presence within the region. There's a South Korean peace activist, and I'll end with this. His name is Kang Jong-gu. He pointed out that the United States needs global weak points just as much as it needs its client states. And he stated that the divided Korean peninsula offers an opportunity for staging power transitions and justifications within the arena of global politics for the United States. In this regard, Korea can serve, he said, as a facilitator or a delayer, a weakener or a strengthener, and so on. And I'm going to end with one point. There has been a long-standing movement for peace on the Korean peninsula. This has largely been something that has been waged by the Korean people, but as you can see, and I hope you could get what I was presenting today, Korea furnishes a pretext for an amplified U.S. military presence, and in that regard, it's all of our issue. And one thing that Kang Jong-gu, that South Korean activist, said, he mentioned something. So this year is the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Armistice Agreement, 60 years of a war regime. And he said, in Korea, the 60th birthday has traditionally been characterized as a milestone that signals the commencement of a new life, one that is qualitatively different from that of the previous 60 years. Life expectancy in the old days was often far shorter than 60 years. He said, likewise, we peace-loving and peacemaking people and organizations are determined to mark 2013, the 60th anniversary of the Armistice Agreement, as the inaugural year of peace, of realizing a peace agreement that has been overdue these past 6 decades. We will arouse public opinion, call upon the main parties to the armistice, conduct and perform campaigns, mass demonstrations, marches, candlelight rallies, and so forth. For almost 6 decades, peace has been deferred because of U.S. imperialism, and then he ends. Isn't it now high time for us to conclude peace in Korea through our own efforts? Thank you.